Hello, everyone. It's CJ. Welcome to another Gadfly live stream. Today is Wednesday, March the 9th. I want to thank you for tuning in to this live stream roundtable discussion with Ken Chorgan Jr. as well as London Paul. Do us a favor, if you have not done so yet, jump over to the gadfly.vhx.tv, learn about our multi-channel network as well as our subscription-based content that we post there. If you're listening in, you're probably on our public platforms, which we have a couple different ones. We have our YouTube channel, and then we also have our Twitter handle, which is at the Gadfly MCN. So much to discuss. I don't want to delay anything. So, Paul, Ken, great day. How are you, gentlemen?
Good afternoon, all.
Yes, good afternoon. I think I was just going to. I think we better drop the London bit because the amount of people who keep getting in touch, going, "I live in London. Can we meet up?"
That's a great point. That's a great point, Paul. And considering the UK and everything else, we just need to drop that all together. So going forward, I want to note to self.
They go, "Well, no, I don't live in London," and then there's a whole conversation. I just thought it might be good to inject something a bit lighter, given the pretty serious conversation we're about to have.
Absolutely. We have to have time to laugh, time to get with family, to disconnect from, all the madness and the chaos that's happening. And I really want to yield the floor to both of you because there's just been so much, the frequency and volume of news that has been released, the amount of information that's coming at us it's pretty rapid fire right now. So, Paul or Ken, whichever you want to open up the conversation, and we can just carry it on from there. So, gentlemen, I yield the floor.
Go ahead and start off, Paul.
Unsurprisingly, we will have to discuss developments associated with the Ukraine war, but I will preface this. We're not going to discuss what apparently is happening tactically and operationally for very simple reasons. There isn't a single person in the Western world who knows what Russia's intending to do, is doing, or has any vague understanding of what they're doing, because that's the nature of war. And we include ourselves in that, of course. We can talk about developments that have happened, and we know for a fact they do. They are concrete developments. But what I would say is, just before and obviously I'll let yield the floor, as you say, to Ken, is all these comments that are all over the Western media, all over social media, talking about the failure of Russia and its tactics, simply have no comprehension that Russia isn't fighting a war to blow Ukraine to smithereens. It is not intending to maximize the civilian deaths and destroy all the entire infrastructure. So when the West goes, "Oh, they're bogged down outside Kiev," no, they're not bogged down outside Kiev. They are waiting for whatever tactics and plans are, which we don't know, but they've encircled the city. And if you're encircling the capital city of a nation that you're at war with, it doesn't really imply that you're losing the war, as the West would like to say. But there are some major developments that have happened in the last 24 hours, and we'll come on to that shortly. But it's an important point. There is nobody who knows what the Russian intentions are in the West whatsoever. There's a lot of people speculating, and because it's not doing what the Americans do, they think it means X, Y, and Z, or they're just repeating what someone in the mainstream media said. Plain simple fact is we don't know, and anyone who's claiming they do know, I'm sorry, it's just simply not the case.
If there's something in history that people need to remember, the Russians have a great understanding of history, not just their own, but how different events have affected other nations, especially in conflict. Back in the early 1970s, especially leading into 1973, every time that the United States appeared that they were going to make Vietnam capitulate, the Vietnamese would demand to come to the conference table, and there would be a ceasefire. But during that time, the Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were rebuilding to carry on the war. They just were in a desperate position, and they used diplomacy as a way to get the U.S. from actually destroying them outright. I see some of that going on right now in Kiev. Most of what they're doing is out of a desperate nature. And I do believe that Russia, knowing the past and understanding the past, is not going to allow the military, whether it's the civilian military or such, the government, to go ahead and try to wait until these jets come in from Poland, or wait until these munitions come in from NATO, or wait to go ahead and rebuild themselves to carry on the conflict even greater. Russia went in with specific an agenda: denazification, neutrality, and NATO not going in. That has not changed. It will not change. The only question is going to be, is Ukraine going to be smart enough to go ahead and facilitate this change, or this policy change in Ukraine permanently, or are they going to have to? Is it going to get to the point that Russia is going to have to go ahead and pretty much destroy the current government in its form and allow one to facilitate that's going to provide Russia its demands and its necessities? But that aside, more than anything, the biggest change, I think, is we're seeing the acceleration of the new multipolar world and the destruction of the dollar hegemony and the unipolar world from the Western side. And to me, while it brings a ton of chaos, it is probably the best thing for humanity that we have so far in the 21st century.
Wow, that's a lot to chew on, Ken.
Well, yes, but
Ken
makes a great point. The one thing, having these talks, and the talks aren't really bearing much fruit, but at no point has Russia said we're having a ceasefire. The war goes on, and the war will continue to go on until you agree to our demands. And of course, they're not going to agree to those demands. And although they've come out today, the Ukrainians, and said, well, we're ready for diplomacy, and we'll talk about neutrality, and we're not giving up an inch of our territory, and we want some security guarantees, but it's all words. It doesn't mean anything until it translates into something of substance. But I think in the last, I would say, 24 hours, we've had some major developments, which I know from the people we interact with and what's happened on Twitter, there's a lot more people who don't. Okay, there's people who support what the Russians do. Of course there is. And there's people who are totally anti-Russian. But there is people coming to us going, well, I don't like Putin, I don't trust it, but I'm not believing the narrative in the West anymore. And those major developments are as follows. There was a lot of speculation for a long time about these biolabs in Ukraine. And the Western media were going, this is disinformation, it's Russian propaganda. Basically there's no such thing. And then, quite inexplicably, Newland, of all people, in a congressional hearing, talking to Rubio, came out and went, well, yes, there are labs in Ukraine, and basically US-led, US-owned, US-operated biolabs, but then had to put in the idea if there's any sort of bioweapons launched, it'll be Russia doing it, which is, of course, utter nonsense. Why would Russia want to launch bioweapon or chemical weapons attacks? But the big thing is people were going, hang on, the media was telling us it was a lie and disinformation by the Russians. Now the Americans have come out and admitted it's true. And then the next question is, what the hell's going on in these biolabs? So it's not just, obviously, the Russians making a big deal about it. The Chinese have joined in. Most so-called global South are starting to ask some serious questions. But there's a lot of Western people are going, hang on, what were they doing there? And, okay, why were the Russians destroying these labs? And I don't think they've destroyed all of them. What's going on? The other thing is the Russians released a whole dossier of information that stated that there was a major offensive planned for Donbass by Ukraine in early March. Now, the interesting thing is there's not been a word out the West to deny any of this or say it wasn't going to happen. So you've then got, okay, from the Russian people's perspective, the approval rating for Putin's rising because they're going, well, hang on, there is biolabs there. What was the intention of them? You know, some of them are pretty close to Russia's border. The other thing is there was clearly now a major offensive planned for Donbass. It was all over the Russian news media yesterday evening. The other thing is there's increasing evidence the West is arming and financing neo-Nazis. So in Ukraine, which is hardly a surprise to us, but these are big developments because in the Russian people's eyes, there's justification. Because there were some people who were going, hang on, why the hell are we going to war with them? It seems a bit of a spurious argument. But when they know there's a major offensive, and the major offensive was to wipe out Donbass, basically kill all the ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, or even Russian-born citizens who lived in Donbass. So that really angers the Russian people. The biolab story will run and run and run. I mean, quite legitimately, the question is, what were you doing there? Because is this in violation of the Geneva Convention? Okay, there's a whole bunch of stories and about what went on there. And frankly, I don't care what. But I don't believe they were just dealing with, well, how's the coal virus and things like that. You don't set up biolabs and then say we're working with the Ukrainians to make sure they don't fall into Russia's hands. Well, why? So Russia's going to go in there and then launch a bioweapon from them? Absolutely not. They're terrified of it falling into Russia's hands. And what was the one thing we said from the start? The United States is more frightened of the Russian invasion than the Ukrainians are. Now we're starting to, in that regard, understand why. So for me, there's some major developments, and it's starting to make people in the West think differently. And it's given a lot of credence to what Russia's doing. And you can no doubt there won't be a lot of people publicly in the circles of Europe in terms of intelligence or bureaucrats or whoever, but there's going to start to be people asking some serious questions to the Americans privately. Well, what were you doing there? Because bear in mind, these biolabs are not only on Russia's doorstep, they're on Europe's doorstep. I mean, you have Poland, that borders Ukraine. You have Hungary, Romania, and depending on the nature of what could be there, and we don't know. I mean, there's a lot of stories about what's there, but this could affect the whole of Europe and beyond. So, hang on, what were you doing there, and were you putting us as nations at risk? Those questions will be asked, but for me, the obvious question is, why did Newland come out and admit it? I mean, and that's an interesting point where the Americans forced into a corner to do this, where basically the Russians said, if you don't come out and publicly admit this, then we're going to do X, Y, and Z. I'm not talking about going to war. They may have a whole bunch of intelligence, and they'll say, if you don't own up to this, then we're going to produce all this intelligence that's going to be far more damning than you admitting to it. It's a possibility to file that under speculation, but something prompted the Americans to admit to something that's now over the gigantic can of worms for them.
Yeah. Good, Ken.
And it's fascinating that Newland is the spokesperson to do this, because Victoria Newland, for the Obama administration and all the CIA and whoever was controlling him during that time, Victoria Newland was the catalyst behind the Maidan coup. She had been tied through the State Department to Ukraine going back to 2013, 2014, etc. So I found it ironic that she was the one who actually came out and did this, because as opposed to the Kamala Harrises, the Bidens, and in many ways the Blinkens of the world, who are just utter buffoons, Victoria Newland is not a dumb person. She is cunningly smart. So for her to do this, I agree that she was either put in a forced position, of which she, if you watched her press conference and her testimony, she didn't come out and admit that it was ours, but she admitted it was theirs. She walked that fine line a great deal, just enough to placate whoever forced her to do this, while at the same time trying to project that it's Russia who's going to do something with these biolabs, not us. But the fact of the matter is just by admitting it now, more and more people are going to question it. And it's a big, big changeover, because when this whole conflict started, it didn't matter if it was Fox News, it didn't matter if it was the Wall Street Journal, it didn't matter if it was a number of people in the conservative realm who, when it comes to domestic policies and domestic politics, yeah, they seem like they're actually on the side of the people. But when it comes to foreign policy, that's one area that you do not go against the establishment. Trump learned that the hard way. It wasn't until he started going after Ukraine, it wasn't until he started going after North Korea, etc., that the impeachments and everything else came about him. That's one thing I learned quite a while ago, is a president can do whatever he wants domestically, but foreign policy is outside the realm of the executive branch, or at least the immediate executive branch. That is the establishment, the NSA, the CIA, and whoever they have in league and ties to that. They're the masters of the Brzezinski chessboard. And if you dare to challenge them on that, then, well, you know what? Your career is gone forever.
Or worse.
Yeah,
Or worse.
exactly.
Or worse, as Kennedy found to his cost. But I think another point worth making, and we said this all along, why the Russians were making beeline to protect Chernobyl. What do we find the Ukrainians claim? There was a power outage at Chernobyl, and then the Russian MODs come out and said, yeah, because it was the substation and power lines were attacked by either the Ukrainian army, but they actually meant the neo-Nazis. And the other thing, the Russian MOD came out. I mean, bear in mind what Newland said yesterday, and they came out and said that the Ukrainians are working on a false flag with 80 tons of ammonia near Kharkov, and then accused the Russians of using chemical weapons. I mean, sure, are we supposed to not draw some conclusion between the two? I mean, is this not some clear evidence of collusion between the Ukrainians and the Americans in intelligence terms and in terms of provocation? Of course it is. I mean, it's absolutely abundantly clear. And as soon as the Americans accused the Russians of going to implement chemical weapons attacks in Ukraine, you absolutely knew that was the stated intention of the Americans to get. Of course, they won't do it themselves. They'll just get their subordinates in Ukraine to do the dirty work for them. Because this is another example where the United States is fighting a war thousands of miles from home, but in this case, they're getting other people to fight the war for them. And playing a very hands-off role, but actually, of course, a whole multitude of proxies are trying to do everything they can internally within Ukraine to fulfill what the United States objectives are. And anyone who's claiming the US isn't behind this war, suddenly they must be asleep, because it's absolutely self-evident that they are responsible for the Ukrainian position in this war, and ultimately responsible, no doubt, for this Ukrainian offensive in Donbass that was planned for early March. And it's self-evident now. All the things are starting to stack up and fit together, and the things we had conjecture about and speculated on are now all coming together and making complete sense, in which case it's reasonable to assume that we were correct in our assertions at that point in time.
Yeah, gentlemen, you both make up great points. And I think at the beginning, there was a very much well-orchestrated, concentrated information as far as controlling the narrative. And even with the alignment of those that were really attempting to isolate Russia. But we're seeing major rifts and major cracks in that narrative. And I think that we should have a discussion regarding that, in whether it's the search for oil, whether it's the whole narrative in regards to this no-fly zone. What do you, gentlemen, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, when it comes to disinformation, you know, the sources are wide and clear. You know, whether it's the media, whether it's the intelligence services, whether it's whomever. But what I found more than anything, and this is the scariest part, is the fact that so few people actually know what's going on, but have the audacity to have a voice and act like an expert when they're speaking on it. You know, whether on Twitter, whether on Facebook, whether on YouTube or the mainstream media, it is amazing how somebody who is little more than a teleprompter reader can come out uh, and just instantly say Putin is a communist, hater, killer, da 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 da, and Russia is this, showing that they have absolutely zero understanding of anything that has occurred since the Soviet Union fell in 1991. When it comes to you know, because Americans, and I'm sure a lot of it in the West as well, Europe and that they have absolutely short memories. One of the more fascinating things was something that popped up yesterday, back in 1997 on the Senate floor. Then Senator Joe Biden stated that the only reason that Russia would show belligerence is if NATO decided to go into Ukraine and put missiles on their borders. The now president of the United States, 30 years ago or 25 years ago, stated exactly the scenario we have today. Now, I don't think he's in a mental capacity that he remembers that speech, but it was at a time when they had the understanding of exactly how Russia would respond in kind. So, with that in mind, is that something that the intelligence services and the State Department have always held in their pocket as a whole card to try to force Russia to jump when they've wanted? Because you know what, over the past, probably going back to not just the Bush years, but definitely the Obama years in the office, there have been so many different things that the United States and NATO have tried to do to get Russia to flinch, to jump, to create a conflict, or to do something that they could point their finger and say, "Ha! There's our scapegoat. Now let's go after him." But Putin never did until now. And the reason now is because, one, the West is at its absolute weakest. Two, there was plain objectives that Russia had spent, I believe, you can correct me on this, Paul, Russia had spent a year planning this. And they probably started the plans back in 2014 after the Maidan coup, what the eventuality, but the current plan was set up about a year ago, looking at all aspects, knowing what's going to happen to their economy, knowing the sanctions that are going to be imposed, solidifying who their allies are, making sure that they have all their ducks in a row, so that when they went in, yes, there would be some short-term issues that would affect them financially, economically, and in the public eye, but in the long run, it's going to make them immensely stronger. And it was a perfect time to go ahead and start bringing forth that multipolar world, even if it means cutting themselves and some of their allies willing to stand up to cut themselves completely off the dollar and watch the Western world start to implode.
Yeah, very well said.
Yeah,
Paul, your thoughts. Good.
I think we need to be a little bit careful here in how we phrase this, because I've seen a lot of people out there going that Putin's move into Ukraine was to take down the dollar. No, it wasn't. Absolutely wasn't. The Ken's right. I don't doubt that the Russians have always been mindful that at some point there will be an escalation in Ukraine. And it's been known for years that was the ultimate red line for Russia, because they'd already seen the US renege on promises to not expand NATO eastward. So we had Poland, the Baltic Republics, Romania, etc. And that's absolutely clear to us. What made the Russians go in? And Ken's right, they will have had plans because they knew where all the key critical infrastructure was militarily and took it all out in an hour and a half. Okay, they've subsequently carried on doing things, but they effectively decapitated a lot of the Ukrainian ability I mean, they destroyed command posts. They couldn't communicate with each other. There's whole divisions and battalions fighting completely blind with no ability to coordinate with anyone else. And I'm no military expert, but even I know when that happens, you're in big trouble. So yes, I'd agree. But as I've said, the principal reasons are they went in is one, there was going to be a massacre or an attempted massacre. And if they'd have had the heavy duty artillery that we know they had on the contact line obviously with Donbass, or the Russian separatist controlled Donbass, they would have just annihilated those people. I mean, and they would have made, there would have been chemical weapons, that false flag attack, all sorts of things to justify it. And the Western world would have just bought this hook, line, and sinker like it does. And Russia went, that is not happening. Then there's the issue of the biolabs. Now we know they had the intelligence from the invasion or the major offensive in Donbass. I think they also got all the intelligence about the biolabs. There was Zelensky running his mouth off about nuclear war or wanting a nuclear option. I think there's enough, and we don't know this, but that they may have been developing nuclear weapons in Ukraine as well. There's another major reason. So we always said there was going to be a number of factors why Russia went in. That's why Putin went in. It wasn't like, well, Ukraine might become a NATO member 6 months later or 5 years later or 2 years later. That's in the future. Or that the US would be putting missiles in there. Well, okay, that can happen pretty quickly. Or US can put bases in there, that can happen pretty quickly. But it kind of looks like the US has had quasi bases in there anyway. Not with US forces, but certainly intelligence assets, etc. It was more, this is the here and now. Our intelligence means that we know there's all these reasons, so that's why we're going in. Now, obviously, Putin also made the point that no matter what we do, this was before the invasion, and there's all this idea it wasn't an invasion, it wasn't a war. This is nonsense. I don't know why Russia's saying this. It's a war. It was an invasion. But anyway, that's a small point. But Putin made the point they're going to put sanctions on us anyway. That's their intention. So we'll just do whatever we need to do. So they went, well, who cares? But they will have known, and Ken's absolutely right about this, that if we go in there, they're going to sanction us anyway. And they've been threatening to cut Russia off from SWIFT since 2014. This is why they put the SPFS in and started to have all this import substitution and do all manner of things to circumvent sanctions and trading in non-dollar terms, dumping treasuries, etc. So they've known about this for years, but they will have known pretty much the extent that cutting us off from SWIFT is likely to some degree. Okay, so they will have made provision, and they will have known full well that there is going to be a blowback on the West for doing this, because anybody knows that the West never engages its brain, because it really doesn't have a brain. It just goes, oh, let's just do this, and there's no thought as to the consequences of what it would do to economies or financial systems. Just a small example, Germany sanctioning Nord Stream 2 shows the level or the lack of anything remotely cognitive going on in their brains. I mean, it's cognitive impairment on a biblical scale. You don't do that to yourself for obvious reasons. I mean, not least that energy prices are spiking. So they will have known this. So the consequences of their actions, Russia would have said, well, to the rest of the world, excluding the US and its attack dogs, they will go, well, we don't want to be part of the dollar anymore. So the consequences Russia would have known would have given them and the world an impetus, or the global south, as people call it, an impetus to de-dollarize quicker and introduce measures to protect themselves. Okay, They probably didn't anticipate them sanctioning the Russian central bank. And to be honest, I mean, that's the one thing I didn't expect, because that is indicative of zero brain cells functioning in the heads of those who make those decisions, because SWIFT is a declaration of war. Sanctioning effectively, or trying to sanction their central bank, is a declaration of nuclear war. That's an instant, we've launched the missiles and the world's obliterated kind of approach. But in a sense, it doesn't really matter to Russia. But so the consequences of the war is that de-dollarization was going to accelerate, and Russia will have known this. But they didn't go in for the sole intention of deciding to destroy the dollar. And this is the reason why. Because they would never willingly put their nation at risk to fight a pointless war in a country they have no intention of occupying or staying there in. I mean, if there was a strategic reason they wanted to annex the whole country, then you'd go, well, okay, there might be a reason. But there had to be justifiable reasons. And the reasons are what we've just highlighted. But the reality is the consequences and the impact on the West financial system and economies is just a byproduct of the fact that they didn't engage their brains as to what the consequences of sanctions will be. And that's probably, for the Russians' perspective, a bit of an added bonus in some ways, because it's accelerating and justifying to them, well, they have to go through more de-dollarization. But the rest of the world's starting to go, we don't want to stick with the dollar either. I mean, India's kind of positioning itself, going, hang on, I mean, maybe we're next, because bearing in mind, the US has been threatening to sanction them over S-400s for the last 6 months. Well, what happens if they don't sanction our banks or sanction our central banks? So they're going de-dollarize. So there are consequences. They're the consequences, but not the reason why they went into Ukraine. They were far more serious reasons, and we've just highlighted what those were.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off that with a question here in a moment, but Ken, I want to give you a chance to jump in there and discuss Paul's comments.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is America, and especially NATO. I mean, you just look at their leader. I mean, he's just an absolute buffoon. But the truth of the matter is that after the fall of the Soviet Union, even with the rise of China in its current state and the rebirth of Russia, America is afflicted with the ignorance of arrogance. They've been able to run roughshod Iraq, Afghanistan, whomever, and gotten away with it no matter what they do, that they really do not feel hiding in their ivory towers there in D.C. They do not feel that whatever they do, they won't come out successful and just simply overwhelm with this, power of economic and military might. But it's the same way with our economic system right now, or I should say the financial system. You stare at insolvency, where your GDP is less by something like $10 trillion of your national debt. That's the official national debt. How much it takes the Fed overnight just to sustain banks and that. And the arrogance to not think that you actually are at the point of absolute collapse and insolvency. This makes it so where the U.S. can simply impose these things and think there's no consequences at all. And, the same thing with, you see that from the vassal states in Europe. We're in lockstep with that. Oh, wait a second, we can't do that. We're not going to stop the energy. We're not going to sanction. Oh, we're going to no, we can't do that. The flip-flopping, because all of a sudden everything that they did in the past, over the past 20, 30 years, where no matter what they did, they could overwhelm and be successful. These are all starting to come home to roost. And because of that, whether it's the politicians in the Senate, the Lindsey Grahams, the Ted Cruz, all those who think that we should just go to war, we should send the military, send this. They have this arrogance and zero understanding of the reality of what the world is today. And I think this is going to cause the U.S. and the West to make even greater mistakes than they're currently doing now. And it's going to be such a detriment that it's going to accelerate the collapse of the West, and it's going to happen not by something Russia does or something China does or OPEC Plus does, but it's going to be from their own ignorance of arrogance.
Yeah.
Just a small point to which Ken makes, which is extremely significant. Well, I'm not saying the points he hasn't, but it made me think of one thing that perhaps is worth stating. And it is a bit of a statement to the obvious, but if the Western economies hadn't gone through and the financial system hadn't gone through the nonsense it has before 2008, but particularly since 2008. So if we were in a situation now where we had healthy economies, we weren't crippled with debt, we didn't have huge inflationary problems and supply chain problems and all those things, we weren't in this position, then the West could, in principle, say, do you know what, we can take a bit of pain with the Russians because we're going to be able to outmaneuver them because we're in a solid position. But they've decided to pick an argument with Russia when the economies and the financial system is in the worst shape it has ever been in history. And that alone shows, as Ken says, the arrogance and the ignorance and just the crass stupidity, because they're picking a fight with a nation who has been tried to sanction into oblivion since 2014, and it's failed. And I made a tweet, and I was, to say surprised, I mean, if I made this tweet a month ago regarding the West needs to understand Russia, I listed a whole bunch of things, net zero debt, trade surplus, huge gold reserves, massive commodities, a huge resource base. Bear in mind, they've hardly explored it in terms of their own nation, their food and energy security. And I made this tweet now a month ago. If I'd have said that, and I maybe got 20, maybe 20, 30 people responding or going, oh, okay, or so a lot of people disagree. I made that tweet yesterday, and to be honest, I was pretty surprised. I don't know how it's quite gone like this, and I don't know what it was, but the last time I looked, I think there was somewhere in the region of well over 4,000 likes, and it being read by about 500,000 people. Now, that for me is an astonishing change of people. And we had a lot, to get that many likes and people, okay, there's some people who don't like it and make on, but a lot of people supporting what was said, because my basic comment at the end is, what's the West got? Now, for me, that's a big fundamental shift of people starting to go, hang on, I am thinking differently about things. I'm starting to go, well, Russia isn't, as Ken said, it's not like it was prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Those days are long gone. It's not that nation anymore. It doesn't mean it doesn't have problems currently. Of course it does, because it's under attack. But I've made the point before. If you'd have sanctioned Western banks and sanctioned Western central banks, within hours, the West would collapse. It wouldn't have lasted, 2 weeks or whatever it is. As near as makes the difference, 2 weeks. That's the big difference. They would just be totally unsustainable. Of course, we're talking hypothetically, because that isn't going to happen. But that's a big fundamental difference. And it's that arrogance. And I think, a lot of people go, well, they must understand what's going on. But a lot of these people, they don't. They're just so conditioned. And they're victims of their own propaganda, their own brainwashing. Then they actually sit there and go, but we're America. We're the greatest nation. We'll always be dominant. We'll always have the dollar. We're invincible. No one can touch us. So how the hell can Russia or China ever pose a threat to hegemony in the US dollar? But they're not actually looking at the reality, because the Fed goes, well, they just gloss everything over. There's this glossing over reality, and they're not facing reality, and they don't believe the reality of what's happening. until obviously there comes a point when it's irrefutable to them. And that's why there's a lot of this arrogance in Western politicians, where you go, well, they must understand. They don't. They don't have a clue what's going on. I mean, they just get told whatever someone wants to tell them. They don't have a grip on reality of what's going on. But I think that's also not just politicians who are just puppets there to do whatever they're told to do, but I think it's permeated through the sort of advisors and that there's just this idea, well, we can't lose because we're America. It's impossible. I mean, we will always win. We'll always prevail. Remember, we're the good guys. And this is Hollywood plays out in the real world. The good guys always win. Look at it in the films. We get to the end, and even when the good guys are on the verge of a crushing defeat at the last minute, the cavalry comes over the hill and we win the war. I mean, this has been going on from films since I was a child, not talking Hollywood blockbusters, and films going back before that. And this is permeated into the consciousness of people in the West then, that they actually don't see the contradiction. So when you go to them, they say things like, well, Russia's the one who always says, who does the opposite of what they're saying, and they don't actually sit there and genuinely think, well, hang on, no, that's what we do, because they're so consumed by this hubris and this belief that they don't actually understand the contradiction of what they're saying. So we all sit there and go, hang on, you just completely destroyed your own argument. It's complete hypocrisy. You must surely see that hypocrisy, but they don't, because a lot of these people have been groomed since childhood. They've gone through an education system. They just have this complete focused belief that we're spreading democracy through the world. It's not hypocrisy. We have to do this because we have to fight those who are trying to attack our freedoms and all the stuff we know. And it's not, oh yeah, there's people masterminding things, damn well the truth. These people on the front, the public figures and what they're saying, they actually believe this. And if you were to sit down with them and go, hang on, are you not spotting the contradiction? Most of them would just go, no. That's the level of derangement that exists. And that's why we have to be worried. That's why they're shooting their mouth off, coming out with comments that if this was any other point in history, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 comments made by Western leaders or members of their government, and I mean, in the West, I include Australia and all this, we would have had a world war by now. It's only we live in the age we haven't. But I mean, the comments are absolutely outrageous with no understanding. Hang on, do you realize the consequences of what you're saying? But again, this is this idea that, well, we're the West, we're always right. And that's the worrying thing. And the problem is when the West doesn't get what they think is going to happen and the world turns out to be very different. Not only you can you imagine the meltdown at the political level, and what's the consequences of that meltdown, never mind how society perceives it, because there's no one who's going to fill that vacuum. We'll be back to that discussion, but let's park that point. But that, I think we need to make that, because there's the idea they're all masterminding devious, and yes, there are devious masterminding people inside administration. No one's disputing that, but there's a lot of them who are just brainwashed to the point they have lost all grip on reality.
That indeed, very well said. As we navigate through this, do you, Paul, do you see Zelensky pivoting and understanding that it's best to come to some type of agreement with Russia in regards to their aspirations of joining NATO? That's question number one. And then question number two is it with the massive involvement that Russia has now partaked into Ukraine, what does that leave for the future of Ukraine? Does that mean a change in government? Does Russia establish a government? I know that there's probably questions that we can't answer because we don't know at this point, but what do you guys envision that may look like?
Well, I think the first question you had ties into the second question, because one, is Zelensky in control, or is the State Department, the CIA, in control of Zelensky? If he's in control of Zelensky, then no, the current government cannot stand. But if Zelensky is in control of the decision making at the ultimate end, then he's going to have to come to that realization and accept some of the demands. And if he does, one, getting rid of the Azov regiment, the neo-Nazification of Ukraine, uh, accepting Donbass region for what it is, and giving absolute assurances that that NATO will not go in there, and missiles will not go in there, and future biolabs will not go in there, etc. ad nauseum, then you know what, he can keep his government, or formulate a new government and still be the leader. But if he doesn't do that, and he proves that he's just a puppet of the West, then there's really no scenario where he or the current government is going to be able to sustain.
Yep, Paul.
No, great questions. I mean, first off, from the Russian perspective, and people will probably profusely disagree with this, they don't want to get rid of Zelensky because it serves no purpose. I mean, people say they want to put a Russian puppet president in. Well, good luck trying to make that happen. I mean, but with regards to Zelensky himself, it boils down to one, and Ken's absolutely right. Who's really in control of it? I mean, it seems to me the far right is controlled by. It certainly looks like it's funded and controlled by Langley, effectively. So Langley is quasi running the government and running Zelensky. So if Zelensky wants to sue for peace and to have an agreement, and let's park the detail of that for a second, then it's self-evident the US is holding the white flag up and going, the war's over, we admit, because the only reason they would do that is they know that if the war carries on to its logical conclusion, then the negotiating position for Ukraine is severely weakened. So therefore, that might be the only reason. Zelensky is not, and I don't think Zelensky is in charge. I don't think he has been in charge. He was very briefly, and he made some very kind of positive kind of overtures towards Russia. And for a brief second, it looked like maybe things will change, but very quickly that changed. So it's self-evident he's not running the government. And it is the far right who effectively running operations via Langley. But let's assume on the basis that there is no negotiated settlement, or there is a negotiated settlement. The outcome's going to be the same. Russia is not going to walk out of Ukraine. Even if there was an announcement, we've reached an agreement, and we're going to have a ceasefire, and we'll sign all these agreements, and the war's over. Russia is not going to sacrifice 1 inch of what its original intentions were, which was demilitarization, denazification of Ukraine. So the issue is, and also recognizing the independence of Lugansk and Donetsk, well, the problem you would have is, even if you could reach an agreement and it's written in stone, that doesn't mean anything, because you could reach an agreement and 5 minutes later, they're going to be launching another offensive on Donbass and Russia's back in again. Or, yes, we'll sign neutrality. And then, I mean, when did the Americans ever, bearing in mind America wouldn't be signing this agreement, when have they ever been trusted to not just 2 months later go, right, start moving missiles in, start doing it? I mean, this is, all these things don't mean anything in reality, even if you sign them in blood, because the US will renege on it. The US has got no intention of ever being truthful to any treaty or thing it's ever signed up to. So The question then comes in, okay, well, if maybe there is some way they can find an agreement and the war can stop, but that doesn't mean demilitarization isn't going to be part of the agreement or denazification is going to be part of the agreement. Well, how are you going to have denazification in the east of Ukraine without having some conflict to remove it? They're not exactly all going to surrender and go, we're laying down our arms and we're disbanding. So again, this is just, it's just not reality. So for me, the question therefore is, okay, if that's their intention, how does that become a reality? Now, they want to protect Donbass at the very least, with Donetsk and Lugansk. So if they're going to enforce them as independent nation, then they have to be some kind of protectorate there. But if it's still inside Ukraine, how is that possible? How is Russia going to be able to sign an agreement with republics? Okay, if they're independent, they're not part of Ukraine anymore. But that doesn't mean that in the future the US can't come back and put missiles in, and we're just back to square one. If you want a solution, then how do you implement a solution? Well, and I'm speculating here, and I'm not saying this will happen. And Russia can say, we don't want to break the country up, we don't want to do this. Well, the country's broken permanent. You can never put that country back together. So there's a logical argument that Russia doesn't annex part of Ukraine, because that doesn't resolve the problem either. They could steal half of the country, but all they're doing is moving the border, and then the US can come back into the new Ukraine. Same problem again. So there's an argument that says, well, let east of the Dnieper, for argument's sake, and this is speculation, form a federation of oblasts, or however it works, and therefore on that basis, they have their independence. They're not going to have any risk of the far right going in, because Russia can stand as a protectorate. It forms a buffer between Russia and Ukraine, and also it provides stability for the east. Okay, then there's the issue of the neutralization question of Ukraine, and we're still back to that, whether Ukraine's the size it is now, or 10% of it, or 50%. That's still a problem. But you have to eliminate a whole bunch of problems to resolve the overarching problem there, because you guarantee that there's going to have to be something pretty stringent put in place. Otherwise, 10 minutes later, or well, not exactly, the US will just be back building new biolabs, making more overtures about future membership for Ukraine in NATO, even though they're saying it's not going to happen. And Europe stupidly believes that that's not going to happen because the US isn't going to tell them. They'll just say when the US decides, well, this is going to happen. So it's a very complicated situation and how it gets resolved. But what I would say is, well, you can never, but the idea, we'll put it this way, if the Russians annex the whole of Ukraine, they're insane. I mean, that would just be absolute nonsense. So I don't see that ever happening. But there'll have to be some compromise, at least with Donbass. And if it extends to Donbass, then where else does it extend to? Where does it end? So it's an extremely complicated situation, which is why your question is fantastic. But I don't think Zelensky's in power. And if the only reason Zelensky would sue for peace, or legitimately, at least legitimately in terms of signing an agreement which would stop Russia from the war that currently in Ukraine, then that would have to be the US has given up. And they're just basically going, well, this is damage limitation from our perspective. Okay, we'll lick our wounds and maybe we'll fight another day in a few years' time when Putin's gone. That could be their reasoning as well. So it is a great question, but it's extremely difficult to answer because for the reasons I've just highlighted.
Something else to take into consideration. I was reminded, a few decades ago when Chechnya had militant terrorists who would go in and were wreaking havoc in the Russian Federation. And now look at Chechnya today. They're allied with Russia,
Good
with
point.
Putin, and with the Russian Federation. Why? Because one of the key things is when a nation knows that the bigger nation supporting it is not going to go in and try to change their culture, i.e., what the U.S. tried to do with the Taliban, and offered them an economic boon to be part of something bigger where they have equal footing with it. If you can get completely rid of the oligarchs, i.e., the Burismas of the world, that have sold their soul to to the politicians in Washington, to getting rid of the neo-Nazis, to getting rid of some of the elements that really has kept Ukraine. I mean, go back to the necessity of Nord Stream 2. It was because a lot when the natural gas and oil was being pumped through Ukraine was siphoning off and stealing a lot of it. So that's where much of the pipelines got cut off, and it had to be moved through different things. If you can get rid of that element, the similar way that Chechnya was able to evolve and become part of the alliance, Ukraine is ripe for economic prosperity if they are willing to get rid of their old system, especially the control by the few, by the oligarchs, by the neo-Nazis and the militants. You get rid of that and provide the opportunity for Ukraine to be part of the Eurasian Economic Union as a whole. All of a sudden, you have a vast territory that's going to prosper, and even far exceed what Europe, the future and potential of European countries are right now.
You make great points, Ken, but I think the problem is that the big difference with what happened in Chechnya is there wasn't that Western influence in that. And Ukraine's unfortunately geographically in a prime spot for massive US intervention and as a tool to try and destabilize Russia and provoke them in. Chechnya wasn't the same, but you make the point, if you could find some way. But the problem is, after what's happened since 2014, and we know that there wasn't just the atrocities going on in Donbass, there's increasing evidence, and it was something said to me with someone I know who took a film crew out there in 14 and 15, and there was some horrendous things going on in Kharkov and other places, and who knows were dotted all around, probably principally eastern Ukraine. These people won't forget this. So what's the odds they're even going to want to tolerate to be part of Ukraine as it is now? There's been too much war, there's too many things gone on for far too long to heal a nation like that is going to be extremely difficult. I mean, and I don't envisage that could happen. And that complicates things enormously. But in an ideal world, unfortunately, we don't live in that, then absolutely for the nation state to remain intact. But I think Putin made the point that if the Ukrainians continue on the path they are, the very idea that the nation will survive as it is impossible. Well, yes, but I would argue it's already impossible. But never say never. But I cannot see how the nation is sustainable. And I made the point quite a few years ago. Eventually, it will have to be broken up into several pieces. And I think east of the Dnieper, you might see a federation, a loose federation of republics who they're not a nation, but they're independent. And yes, there'll be cooperation between them, and the federation could form effectively another nation, so to speak. But I think that's far more likely to happen. And that might be the only resolution. At least that will prevent future conflict in Donbass, etc. But it doesn't resolve the fundamental problem of Ukraine and its neutrality. And and who knows all the geopolitical problems that will ensue from that. But it's a failed state, and it's a nation broken, and it's going to be extremely difficult to fix that nation given what's happened. And then it was quiet.
Hey, you there, CJ? Oh, did we lose CJ?
Can you
I
guys
don't
hear me
know,
okay?
but it's okay.
My mute button was stuck. So, yeah, I wanted to follow up and just any closing comments, gentlemen. Want to thank you for a great conversation today. So, let's close this session out. And any closing comments from both of you?
I'll go ahead and start. Yeah, one of the things that people need to realize, and it's kind of funny because President Biden yesterday, when he was speaking on something else, a reporter yelled at him and said, "What are you going to do about gas prices?" And he says, "Oh, there's nothing we can do about it. It's all Russia." The reality is as this conflict comes to a close, as things start to slow down, wind down, and the news cycle moves on, just recognize that not a single other thing has changed in the West. While the markets have been volatile, while commodities have been volatile, the Fed still has a decision, probably a wrong one, no matter what they do. The inflation is going to continue to rise. The political morass is going to get worse. So just, while this has been at the forefront, the reality is that what's going on in Europe, what's going on in the United States, financially and economically, has not changed, is getting worse. And it's going to hit us full bore once the Russian-Ukraine conflict gets off of the front pages of the newspapers and the breaking stories of the mainstream media.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Paul.
you make great points, and I'll follow that up. Here's the point as well. Yeah, things are getting worse, and the blowback from sanctions is a clear indication of that. But here's the other point. Let's just say the war ends tomorrow. And there's an agreement, and it's all signed and sealed in a week. I'm exaggerating for effect, but this is the reason why. Is the West going to suddenly stop all the sanctions on Russia? No, of course they're not. So the sanctions are just the blowback and effect of it is just aggravating already a very precarious situation. And we're not here to discuss all the financial stuff now, but we're just seeing markets blowing up. Some things in the last 24 hours, and very indicative that the ESF and the plunge protection team are desperate. So they're hammering gold and silver today. They're hammering the price of oil. And I made a tweet a week ago, going, if it gets over $130 a barrel, they're going to start panicking. And what do we find? It hits 130 today on Brent. They smash it down 10%. So they're having to deal with a whole bunch of problems that have been exacerbated and aggravated by these sanctions, and some fallout from the war, but not entirely there. And as Ken rightly says, that's not going to go away. Even if the war stops, it's not going to go away. Those problems are there. They're not going to disappear. Things are just getting worse and worse. The entire Western financial system is creaking. Economies are cratering, and they can't do anything to fix those problems. And therefore, I think partly that's why they wanted to carry this war on as long as possible, because in some ways they might be able to justify some measures if to try and alleviate some of the problems. But in reality, and it's only a short-term fix. It's not like we can actually fix anything, because we know they can't. But I think that's something, and it's a great closing point to make, Ken, that it doesn't change anything. Things we're in a really bad shape financially, economically, and have been for all the reasons we've discussed previously. The sanctions are making it worse, but what are they going to do? Sign an agreement where actually it looks like Russia's kind of won because they got all what they wanted? And then the US and Europe's going to turn around and go, okay, well, you've left. Well, we're removing the sanctions. No. Well, if otherwise, that's like complete capitulation. I mean, politically, that's political suicide for these people who've put all this investment in we're going to crush Russia, and then it comes out and they go, oh, hang on. So Russia wanted all these agreements in place, and it's happened. You've removed all the sanctions. We're crippled, and Russia's, Russia. Yeah, it's had a bit of a rough period, but it doesn't look like anything's really happened to them. That's political suicide, and not just short-term political suicide for like Macron, who's got the presidential elections. It's just in April. It's just general political suicide, and the blowback domestically in Europe and beyond would be devastating for them. So I'm sure Russia are also mindful of that. So there's an argument that says, well, we have to have something that's pretty solid in place. And we're back to that point. I don't see how they do, because, I mean, are they going to also demand that's written into the agreement that if this is signed, all sanctions to be removed? I mean, you'd want that in place. Are the Americans going to agree to that? Probably not. So we could be stuck in this complete sort of quagmire for who knows how long, even if Russia comes out and the war's over and officially they have won the war, and to reach an agreement, my goodness, it's going to be, well, as things stand, pretty much impossible. There's going to have to be an enormous caving in from the US perspective. And again, that's one of those things. The US isn't going to want to appear to have caved in, because it just weakens their position even more. I mean, whilst it might not be obvious publicly what happened with Afghanistan, privately, the blowback to the United States reputation on the world stage was devastating for them, because even their allies started going, hang on, the greatest nation on the earth being kicked out of Afghanistan, and the Taliban were in power within hours after being installed. It'd take them months. The US lost a lot of credibility. Their NATO allies, if the US caves in with regards to Ukraine, that might really be the end. I mean, NATO's had it anyway, but that might be the catalyst that breaks NATO up rapidly, because suddenly Europe's going to go, hang on, you caved in. We've still got this problem on our doorstep. So there's an awful long way to go in this, and there's no simple answers. We've really, in some senses, only scratched the surface of it.
Yeah. Yep. Gentlemen, very well said. Paul, Ken, want to thank you both for a great conversation. I know I truly enjoyed it. Hopefully those listening in, as well as our Gadfly subscribers, did as well. Do us a favor, like, comment directly on this video. You can also check out our multi-channel network over on the gadfly.vhx.tv. Find out about our subscription-based content. We frequently post their updates, live stream roundtable discussion similar to this as well. So, gentlemen, thank you so much, and we will do this again real soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes, thank you.